Jordan Peterson and Elon Musk recently sat down for a conversation where one of the topics they covered was antinatalism. Now, they've both previously made comments about antinatalism or even engaged in debates around antinatalism, and I wanted to respond to the points they made in this specific conversation, so let's get into it.
I talked to a philosopher a while back who was an antinatalist.
So very quickly here, Jordan is referencing a debate that he had a few years ago with David Benatar, who is one of the foremost proponents of antinatalism. Now, I will leave a link in the description to that debate so you can watch it for yourself. I also did a live stream reaction to it, which I'll also leave a link in the description. Personally, I think Jordan really made a poor display of himself in that debate, but you can watch it for yourself. And if you do, come back here, leave a comment, let me know what you think.
There was a recent research article published on this too. Antinatalists are much more likely to show dark tetrad traits: Machiavellian, psychopathic, narcissistic, and sadistic, because those first three weren't enough, right? And so those things are tightly aligned, especially the best predictor was psychopathy for being an antinatalist.
Sure.
Right. Well, and the psychopaths are very, very, very self-centered, right? They're like overgrown 2-year-olds, overgrown, aggressive 2-year-olds.
So I'm going to pop up on screen now the study that Jordan, I believe, is talking about. The study actually doesn't mention sadistic or sadism at all. So I'm not sure where Jordan got that from. But to address the point that Jordan is making about some antinatalists having unsavory characteristics or personality traits, I have no doubt certain antinatalists will have unsavory personality traits. In fact, one of the reasons that people are antinatalist is because we know that some of the people that we create will go on to have unsavory personality traits. And if we don't want those around, then the only sure way to avoid that is not to create people in the first place. Now, I've linked the study in the description. I'm not going to go over the study in detail because I don't feel like I'm qualified to. I know certain people who have disagreements with it. I know certain people who take it seriously. I've left a link in the description so that you can look over it and make your own mind up about the study. But even if you accept the conclusions as true, as Jordan is putting forward, that says nothing about antinatalism itself, and in my eyes simply lends further support to the antinatalist point that we don't want to be bringing people with unsavory personality traits into existence. Maybe I have a horrible take on this. If I do, let me know in the comments. The overall point, though, that I would put forward to Jordan is it's better to tackle ideas based on the ideas, not on the people that hold them. There is a large contingent of antinatalists out there who are completely normal people who you would pass on the street but happen to intellectually have an antinatalist position, and it's out of care for the being who may be created. Jordan, with the audience he has, not mentioning these people and simply focusing on the people who have unsavory personality traits, paints a pretty unfair picture of antinatalists, which I know is kind of in his favor because he wants to demonize them and has done historically, as has Elon Musk. But if you're going to have that large an audience that both of them do combined, it's kind of irresponsible to be painting false pictures of groups of people, in my view.
One of the fundamental ethical problems is different than a scientific problem. One of the fundamental ethical problems that's plaguing the West is this catastrophically low birth rate. And you know, when you start making public
observing the numbers, I mean, I noticed this 20 plus years ago, that the trend in birth rates for really all countries past a certain level of economic development was trending to well below replacement, if not already below replacement. And if you extrapolate the curve, which one always has to be cautious about extrapolating any demographic curve, but so I always preface by saying if these trends continue, most countries will dwindle into insignificance.
So I've been thinking about that in relationship to sacred images. Okay, well, the sacred image of masculinity in the West is a crucifixion, but a man who's crucified. But the sacred image of a woman isn't a woman. The sacred image of a woman is a woman and an infant, right? It's a dyad and not a monad.
Sure.
Right. And in the Christian view, those two images, you know, they vie for supremacy, right? I mean, obviously, Christ is the superordinate image, but Mary as the mother of God is the female equivalent. And so one of the things I've been playing with at an axiomatic level is the notion that unless the feminine is conceptualized as the combination of female and infant, then the culture has lost its attachment to the traditional sacred images and is probably on its way out.
I think there's an argument that when a culture loses its religion, that it starts to become antinatalist and decline in numbers and potentially disappear.
So the first thing I want to point out here is that they've actually changed the way they're using antinatalist. When they were talking about antinatalists before, when they were referencing the study, they were talking about people who have a moral opposition to procreation. Now they've moved on to cultures and countries that are antinatalist. There is no culture or country in existence today that I'm aware of anyway that is antinatalist for moral reasons. What I think they mean here is an individual or culture or country that is simply less motivated to procreate, or maybe a country that maybe even unintentionally has put some barrier in the way to people procreating. These are two very different things, and for these two men who people often claim are some of the brightest minds in existence today, to use the same term to describe these two very different things is pretty sloppy. But anyway, getting on to the substance of what they were saying. So I'm pretty skeptical of the idea that declining birth rates that we're seeing today is as a result of like antinatalistic culture or policies or things like that. And there's a range of reasons for that. The first is that declining birth rates have, like many things, become part of a culture war, and it's kicked around like a ball between the different sides of the political spectrum. People like Jordan Peterson or Elon Musk really like to moralize the issue, fit it into these grand narratives, or try and attach conspiracy theories to it. But as far as I can tell, the declining birth rates that we've seen are simply as a result of decreasing infant mortality and increase in the standard of living and wealth, and also the emancipation of women. And these are all good things. They just happen to lead, as we've seen historically, to a decline in the number of children that people have. It's not by and large because of some antinatalist culture or governmental policy. If anything, the governmental policies tied to procreation that we've seen recently have all been massively pro-natalist. I've already covered this in other videos, so what I'll do is I will include those as links in the description, and you can go to those videos to look at examples of pro-natalist policies from countries around the world. On the point of countries losing their religion and as a result having declining birth rates or becoming more antinatalist, I'm not really sure what the evidence is for this. I know that there are some religious sects who have extremely high birth rates, either because of some sort of religious prescription to multiply or the rejection of contraception in their religious doctrine. But it's also the case that in many countries we would consider very religious, they have basically the same birth rates as countries we would consider not really religious at all.
Okay, you had a rough childhood.
Yeah.
Yeah, like rough and tumble, rough childhood. Plenty of fights, and a father who was a difficult creature to contend with. So what did that? Okay, why aren't you bitter about that? Because that's a pathway that people take.
I think that there are one can take, and often people do take, the path of vengeance.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah. So, or
that's what antinatalism is.
Yeah, to feel that the world has treated them unfairly, and that they will visit upon the world that which the world has visited upon them, and
justify it by recourse to the reality of their own suffering, which is often intense.
So the idea that antinatalism is a reaction to a bad childhood is a really poor analysis, if you can call it an analysis at all. Antinatalists come from all walks of life, all lifestyles, all cultures, a range of different religions, different times and places throughout history. To boil that down to antinatalism as a philosophization of you having a bad childhood is kind of childish. First, I want to cover how someone's own suffering can inform their antinatalism, and then I want to cover this idea that antinatalists are just trying to visit upon others the things that were visited upon them. So the first one, I wouldn't be surprised if a disproportionate amount of antinatalists had quite bad lives. You don't need to have had a very bad life to be an antinatalist. I and many other antinatalists have had good lives so far, but realize on an intellectual level that it's better never to have come into existence, and can also observe the suffering of others and use that to inform their own antinatalism. But of course, some antinatalists will use their own suffering to inform their antinatalist views, and that to me is completely valid. If you've experienced deep suffering in your life, it brings you into contact in a very real way with the suffering that antinatalists often reference when arguing for their position. One of the main arguments for antinatalism is the risk argument, that there are very bad lives that people live, and when you create someone, you don't know if their life is going to be one of those lives. So if you're living one of those lives that are referenced as a very bad bad life, it's understandable that you don't want to then run the risk of imposing that on someone else. And that brings me to the next bit about antinatalists visiting upon others that has been visited upon them. They're acting like antinatalists are acting out of hatred. Don't get me wrong, there are misanthropic antinatalists. There are many misanthropic non-antinatalists as well. But antinatalism itself is a concern for the being who could be created. This is the opposite of visiting upon someone what was visited upon you. That would be having a bad childhood yourself and then creating a child and making sure they have a bad childhood. Antinatalism, if an antinatalist has had a bad childhood, is recognizing you've had a bad childhood and then saying, I don't want to run the risk of imposing a bad childhood on someone else, and so I'm not going to create someone to ensure that that doesn't happen. How is that in any way visiting upon someone else what has been visited upon you? It's completely different. In fact, the antinatalist approach, I would say, is much more responsible, especially if you feel like having a bad childhood means that you're not fully equipped to be able to provide someone with a responsible and healthy parental figure. So this idea that antinatalists are just out to try and hurt people because they've been hurt themselves is the complete opposite of what is generally true. Anyway, I've linked the full conversation that Elon and Jordan have in the description if you want to go over it. I've picked out the bits where they actually talk about antinatalism. Let me know what you thought of their thoughts on antinatalism. Let me know what you thought of my thoughts on their thoughts, and I'll see you in the next one.